Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the School of Muscle. Today, we have on Miguel Blacutt. And Miguel, he is currently working on his bachelor's degree in nutritional sciences, and he's going to pursue his master's degree, and he's definitely going to pursue a PhD as well. And he's a coach at ReviveStronger.com. He's been an author on various evidence-based articles kind of all around the fitness industry. And Miguel, he really knows his stuff. He loves the science. He's super passionate about it, and I think you'll definitely see that come through in this episode. And in this episode, we discuss the Leucine Threshold, the refractory period, muscle damage, and much more. So, without further ado, Miguel Blacutt. All right, Miguel, so kind of the first thing that I want to discuss here is there's this thing that's the Leucine Threshold, where you reach this, you eat enough leucine in a meal, and you maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And I think there's some confusion around whether it's kind of an on-off switch to where if you don't reach this threshold, then you don't get any muscle protein synthesis. So could you kind of speak to the leucine threshold and whether you need to have like 20 grams of quality protein to stimulate protein synthesis at all, or do you still get kind of a stimulus from less protein?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, Ryan, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate being on here in your podcast with along with such great interviewers that you had so far.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
So I think that when we talk about the leucine threshold, it's a very mechanistic topic that I don't think necessarily a lot of people need to be so concerned about. I think that what we need to think about is really the practical applications of it. So since you asked about the mechanism, I'll tell you, but then I would like to just sort of bring it back to the practical application of what this actually means. So, yes, leucine does seem to have a threshold on muscle protein synthesis, but a threshold isn't necessarily an on-off switch like a lot of people think about. It is more of if you think about a graph, it has a logarithmic value, meaning that instead of going from 0 to 100 just like that, it just escalates incredibly quickly. So what sort of caused people to question this leucine threshold value again is Jorn's post on Shredded by Science, or Stronger by Science, where he says that about 5 grams of protein is actually enough to start to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Now, when we look at that research, it was research done out of Moore et al. In 2009, where what they did is they took a group of people and they made them fast overnight. They came into the lab and they did a pretty exhausting leg workout. So they did, I believe, leg press, leg extensions, and leg curls, 4 sets to failure. So they were fasted. They trained, and then they got a drink that had either 0, 5, 10, 20, or 40 grams of whole egg protein. So essentially what you did here is you completely primed people to stimulate protein synthesis because they're fasted. So they have nothing in their stomach, in their intestines, anything like that to kind of blunt or mix into what's getting digested. They just trained really, really hard in the legs. I mean, you do leg press, leg extension, leg curl, all 4 sets to complete failure. That's exhausting. And then you have a very high quality protein. We know that egg protein is one of the most bioavailable protein there is. So yeah, after all of this, they measured protein synthesis, and they found that 5 grams of protein stimulated protein synthesis more than 0. Makes sense. 10 more than 5, 20 significantly more than 10, and then between 20 to 40, there was a little bit of an increase, but it didn't reach statistical significance, which causes us to say, all right, well, after 20 grams of a very high quality protein, the amount of protein synthesis that you will see afterwards is minimal, which causes us to say between 20 to 40 grams of a high-quality protein source. So if we think about this, I think that if we're testing it in a lab, then yes, we can get protein synthesis out of 5 grams of a very high-quality protein source, again, in the fastest situation after training. But for the majority of us, we're not doing that. We're not overnight fasted. We're not setting ourselves and priming ourselves up to see that little spike in protein synthesis. So I think that rather than thinking about hey, what is the minimal amount of protein that I can use in order to stimulate protein synthesis to see a spike in it when we're measuring it in a lab through IV leucine tracers. It is the question should be, what is the optimal amount of protein that I need in order to stimulate protein synthesis for a long period of time and actually sustain the process of building muscle mass. And that does seem to be those 20 to 40 grams of the high quality protein source. I think that if you were to actually measure protein synthesis across time in them, or even across just like a week, you wouldn't see much net protein accretion, aka you wouldn't see them actually put on a whole lot of muscle mass. Especially if they were more well trained. Maybe if they were complete beginners, then things are a little bit easier. But as you train more and more, then we just need more things to be in your favor. But I think that if you were to take the group that had the 20 and 40 grams of protein, and you measured their protein accretion across time, that is where you would see gains being made rather than in the 5 or even the 10-gram group.
Okay, gotcha. So if you are kind of more primed for muscle protein synthesis, maybe you fasted and your body's kind of ready for that protein, you think you can respond a little bit better to a lower dose. And then if you've, say, recently had a protein feeding or you're not like totally fasted, then maybe you need a larger dose to get a full stimulus of muscle protein synthesis. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, so it seems that the way that leucine works is that more than anything, you have to increase it above what it is at that level. So you have to sort of, when you're in a fasted state, it seems like you almost have to double it. You have to maximize protein synthesis. So you have to reach a concentration at about 300 millimolar, something like that. So then what happens is that as you become, as you have more food in your gut, as you have other things maybe interfering with absorption, as you already have higher levels of plasma amino acids, you need more protein in order to get that extra amount of leucine in the blood. So yeah, if you're completely fasted, then having a smaller amount of protein can stimulate protein synthesis. When you have more food in your gut, when it's later on in the day, when your plasma amino acids are already a little bit higher, then it will take a little bit more. And this is actually something that I use in order to give advice to people who do intermittent fasting. Because let's say you're fasting and you train. Well, that means that you don't need as big of a scoop of protein in order to stimulate protein synthesis. Maybe rather than using, because people want to save their calories when they're doing intermittent fasting, rather than having to get in 40 grams of protein, hey, just have like 15 to 20, which, depending on your protein, it's not even going to be like 100 calories before you train. And that's going to stimulate protein synthesis while you train.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's another kind of theory about the refractory period, to where if you stimulate this protein synthesis, you get a rise in muscle protein synthesis, that you have to wait a certain amount of time before eating protein again, or else you don't really get another elevation in muscle protein synthesis. So could you kind of speak to what the refractory period is, kind of how long you might want to space out meals and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So if we get back to what I said about it seems that what really matters is increasing the leucine concentration or the plasma amino acid concentration above what it is. That is what mTOR kind of senses, and mTOR being the master regulator of protein synthesis is the actual increase in amino acids rather than the absolute amount. Yes, the absolute amount, but it seems that more so it's the increase. So the refractory period, what that is basically, all right, so you consume like 20 to 40 grams of a high quality protein source and you elevate plasma levels of amino acids, right? Stimulate protein synthesis. What the theory is that if those levels are already at the top, then consuming another high quality protein feeding isn't going to raise them enough to get another stimulation of protein synthesis. And if it does, because there is some research that shows that it does, it won't be as large of, you won't get as much protein synthesis out of that. So what the theory behind the refractory period is that rather than having all these little tiny protein feedings where you just get a little amount of protein synthesis, it is better to allow the plasma amino acid levels to fall. Probably takes about 3 hours. So then when you eat another protein feeding, it gets that big spike in protein synthesis again, rather than those maybe smaller ones. What I will say about this is that this is all just kind of highly theoretical. We don't have any hard, conclusive proof on it. And if the refractory period is a thing, we don't have any long-term data showing, all right, well, will it actually lead to a different amount, like a different net protein synthesis, to have one big spike in protein synthesis compared to a ton of little ones? Will this actually practically lead to more muscle gain? We don't have that data.
Okay, gotcha. So what if you had, I mean, this is probably just complete speculation, but say you have just like in isolation, say you just drink a whey protein shake right after your workout. Would you say then that might only take like an hour and a half or 2 hours before you might space your next meal? Or if, say, you had a casein shake, should you wait longer than that 2 or 3 hour mark? Do you think that it matters on the type of protein you have or the type of meal you have?
Right. So if we look at the protein synthesis in whey versus casein and what they do to plasma amino acid levels, a whey isolate or probably even a whey concentrate is going to lead to a very large spike in amino acid levels, but then it's going to fall down very quickly. Casein, and by very quickly, I mean, yeah, by about like an hour, hour and a half or so, casein is not going to lead to such a big spike. It's going to stimulate protein synthesis, and it's going to just remain a little bit more level. So that is kind of where we see, hey, maybe a casein shake is good for a sustained period of time, like maybe before bed. Again, we don't have any hard data on that. But to get back to the refractory period, just to kind of give the listeners a little bit of food for thought on kind of the data that we do have on it, and the data that I think would be beneficial to do on it, is that we have a study by Arita et al., where what they did is they gave people 80 grams of protein throughout the day. And they spaced it out, and one group got 8 meals of 10 grams of protein. And this is whey protein, right? So high quality protein. We're not talking about like beans or anything. So 8 by 10, they had a group where they got 4 meals of 20 grams, and they had a group where they got 2 meals of 40 grams, right? So either 8 meals of 10, 4 meals of 20, or 2 meals of 40. And they found that the group that had the 4 meals of 20 got the most amount of protein synthesis. So this was kind of used to say, like, see, there's a refractory period. The group that got the 8 meals of 10 grams didn't get much protein synthesis compared to the ones that had the 4 meals. But if we think about this, if you get 8 meals of 10 grams, then neither of those meals has enough leucine to actually stimulate protein synthesis. The research that we need to do is we need to do that, but with a higher protein intake. I would be interested in seeing, all right, so what would happen if we do like feed people 120 grams of protein per day? Then we can do like 6 meals of 20 grams. We can do 4 meals of 30 grams, and 3 meals of 40 grams, and 2 meals of 60 grams, and see what the differences in protein synthesis is. Because then we are testing all different dosages that actually have enough leucine to stimulate protein synthesis. Do that in resistance trained people, and then we can get a bit of a better idea on how this refractory period thing works.
Right. Yeah, that would, as with most things, there's usually a study that we can think up that would be awesome to look at it. But then when you think about like actually going to do the study, there's a lot of other like practical implications that make it tough. But
and that's why I need my PhD already. I just need to like be able to do just studies on command. I need to be like 10 years.
Exactly. So I think that is kind of a great recap of kind of the leucine threshold and the refractory period. So I think the next thing that I want to move on to is that you recently wrote a really awesome article on revivestronger.com, which I'll definitely link below and link in the show notes, about muscle damage and how it might not be an actual driver of hypertrophy. So would you kind of like to discuss what the drivers of hypertrophy actually are and why muscle damage potentially might not be a large component of this?
Right. So that's a great question. I'd love to talk about this. So in 2012, Brad Schoenfeld published an article where he states that there are 3 main drivers to muscle hypertrophy, those being mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Mechanical tension is exactly what it sounds like. It is a tension that you place upon the muscle fibers. Then muscle damage is a little micro tears in your muscle fibers that you've heard all the bros tell you about, that's what you need for growth. I mean, anyone who stepped into a gym has heard that. Metabolic stress is the accumulation of byproducts of anaerobic glycolysis, which is the process that is needed to generate energy. So it's like likely the accumulation of inorganic phosphate, of creatine, and the lack of oxygen in the muscles. So that was the original theory: is muscle hypertrophy is caused by these three things. But then new research where we kind of isolate for a few of these variables has shown that, all right, well, maybe muscle damage isn't exactly needed. And metabolic stress probably isn't needed either, but let's focus on muscle damage. So if we isolate for muscle damage, for example, let's say that we have someone do blood flow restriction training, all right? So blood flow restriction training, it restricts the venous return of blood. It allows for about the same level of hypertrophy as a regular resistance training, but because you're using very light loads, it doesn't cause muscle damage. However, we see the same amount of hypertrophy as traditional resistance training that does cause damage. If damage is one of the main drivers of hypertrophy, we should at least see a slight difference here. If we look at marathon runners or people who run downhill, those are things that cause a lot of damage, but no tension, yet we see no growth. So that causes us to question, all right, so if we get if damage is a primary driver of muscle hypertrophy, that means it should be able to stimulate hypertrophy on its own, but it doesn't. Again, we look at things that cause a lot of damage. Downhill running, marathon, sprinting, those things don't, well, sprinting does a little bit, but that's because there is tension, but they don't cause hypertrophy. There was a study by Flannetal. It's a very famous study where what they did is they took individuals and they gave them an 8-week protocol of using the leg ergometer, and one group of people got a 3-week intro block. Essentially, like those people did the protocol for 11 weeks. Now, an intro block is going to reduce damage by starting to induce the repeated bout effect and just get people's bodies familiarized with the protocol. So you had one group of people that basically did it in 11 weeks. And then you had one group of people who did the same amount of volume, but compressed into 8 weeks and without the intro block. And what you found was that both groups got the same amount of hypertrophy. Now, the group that did the 8-week without the intro block got a hell of a lot more damage. And in fact, the group that got the intro block, the one that did it within 11 weeks, had no detectable damage, but they both got the same amount of hypertrophy. So if damage is one of the main drivers of hypertrophy, we should at least see a difference in muscle hypertrophy. But in most of these situations, we do not. So all these things started to sort of build the case against muscle damage not being a main driver of hypertrophy. And it's things that myself, Menno Hensmans, Chris Beardsley, one gentleman who wrote about it on Stronger by Science, people started to question the role of muscle damage on muscle hypertrophy, saying, hey, if damage is a primary cause of hypertrophy, why isn't it causing hypertrophy in these situations? And all of this led Wackerhage and Schoenfeld to actually update the model of muscle hypertrophy last month in 2018, saying that it seems that mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy, and progressive tension overload, progressive overload seems to be what keeps the gains coming. While metabolic stress and muscle damage, it seems that they aren't primary drivers of hypertrophy, but they may be able to enhance it. It does seem that there are some pathways in which metabolic stress and muscle damage can enhance hypertrophy, but we don't know if there is an upstream mechanism in which mechanical tension is actually causing those things, or whether you actually need muscle damage and metabolic stress in order for those things to be caused. And where we're at right now, it seems that we can't avoid damage, because if progressive tension overload is the main driver of hypertrophy, then just by you doing more, lifting more weights, doing more reps, sets, stuff like that, you are going to cause muscle damage. So it's not something that we can avoid, but it is not something that we should seek. There is a study by Ferry, and basically what they did is they made people train with 8 sets of 10 in the bench press to failure. So you can imagine the amount of I have chills just thinking about that pec soreness. It's the best/worst feeling ever. But they made people do that, and then they measured when strength and total work capacity came back. So when they could do volume, the same amount of volume again, and they measured it at 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours. Within 96 hours, strength returned, but the ability to do the total amount of work did not. So if we think of volume, mechanical tension seems to be the main driver of hypertrophy, and that's mediated by volume. So if we're taking that stance, then it seems that chasing damage is going to reduce the total amount of volume that you can do and probably hinder hypertrophy a little bit, because if you can't recover fully within 96 hours, then that is going to hinder the total amount of volume that you can do throughout the week and your ability to progress in volume in subsequent weeks.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So basically, muscle damage, we're pretty sure that it's not a primary driver by any means, and kind of best case scenario, it's not going to hinder things, and worst case scenario, it could actually reduce the amount of force you can produce, reduce the amount of volume you can accumulate, and things like that. Does that sound about right with where we're at on muscle damage?
I would say so. I think in the best case scenario, it doesn't hinder things, and it allows for a greater amount of satellite cell activation, and can sort of kickstart the immune response that we need in order to muscle building. And then worst case scenario, it hinders it and doesn't do anything at all. I think that we don't have enough evidence to be like, hey, it doesn't do anything at all. I think where we're at right now is that maybe it sort of helps satellite cell activation, maybe. But again, we don't know if satellite cells will be maximally activated for muscle hypertrophy just with progressive tension overload, or if muscle damage is actually needed for it.
Okay, I think that's a good recap there. And when kind of to bring this back to the kind of the practical realm, when you're kind of doing your programming and stuff for clients, what types of things are you kind of putting in place to make sure that damage isn't getting excessive, and that you're focusing on mechanical tension? What are you doing in your actual programs to make sure that we're kind of abiding by these rules of the primary driver, and that muscle damage probably is something that could almost hinder stuff?
Great question. So there are probably two main things that we need to focus on. One is the repeated bout effect. The mechanisms of the repeated bout effect aren't 100% known yet, but basically what it is that your body doesn't want muscle damage. It's damaging. So there is a few mechanisms that come into play that your body's going to take when you first do an exercise to sort of protect against the damage. And this is actually one of the things that's used to kind of argue against muscle damage is, hey, if your body can protect against it, we see a decreased amount of damage, but we still see increase in hypertrophy. So anyways, what it means is that when you introduce an exercise, your body is going to sort of put in place these protective mechanisms to avoid damage and to avoid soreness. If you are to constantly introduce new exercises, if you constantly chase soreness, you're going to just constantly be inducing muscle damage, and that is likely going to hinder your ability to accumulate volume across time. So the first thing that I do is that when people come to you for coaching, they think, all right, well, every mesocycle, this guy's going to give me new exercises because like everything has to be innovative. And they find out really quickly that is not the way things happen. If I just spend like 4 weeks trying to get the motor patterns laid out and to really get this movement ingrained to you, reduce the damage that causes movement, and maximize the hypertrophy out of this movement, I am not going to go just switch things up after 4 weeks just for you to feel that, hey, I paid this guy, so every week he's going to create a new program. No, you paid me to get your results. The results are going to come from us really cashing in on the exercises that we kind of set the stage for. That's the one thing that I will do is I do not constantly introduce new exercises, specifically the compound exercises where you can lift more weights and things just can be a little bit more damaging. Things like bicep curls, tricep extensions, those things, pretty much it's just elbow flexion, elbow extension. Your body can pretty much do all of them without getting excessively sore, assuming that you've already been doing them. The second thing that I put into place is that it seems that eccentric exercise is the most damaging, and that is because eccentric exercise is dominated by type 2 fibers, and those are just really, really sensitive to muscle damage. Muscle damage seems a big cause of it seems to be the ripping of the actin myosin bonds. For the listeners, that's kind of what causes muscle contraction. And just think of like muscle contraction as like a Velcro linking, and then eccentric exercise is kind of like the Velcro tearing apart, just a little bit more violent, and that's kind of what causes damage. So if we do very slow eccentric exercises, that is going to cause a whole lot of damage. So some exercises, we do need a good eccentric portion, and the eccentric portion does seem to cause a lot of hypertrophy, actually. But that does not call for doing super slow eccentrics. People will do like 8-second eccentrics in order to just like feel the soreness because they think, hey, if I'm sore, it works. But that is likely not the case. Things like an RDL, a chest flight, sure, we might need a 2 to 3 second eccentric on that, but that's sort of where we cap it. And if we're looking at, for example, we want someone to peak for a meet, for a show, for something like that, then we might take those things out because, again, they're going to cause a lot of damage.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And is there anything that you're kind of looking for in particular when to actually switch exercises? So say they've gotten really good at an exercise, they're not getting much damage anymore. Is there anything when would you actually switch one of those kind of big compound lifts?
That's a really good question. It depends on a few things. So if it is a very advanced athlete that is kind of lean enough for me to be able to distinguish like where they need to build more muscle mass, then I can switch compound movements depending on what I'm trying to build. For example, I can switch from a low bar squat to maybe like a safety bar squat or a front squat if I'm trying to get a little bit more quad development. If I really, really want to nail the hamstrings, I can switch like a slower RDL versus like a conventional deadlift, something like that. But getting back to it, like if it's an advanced athlete, I might switch things up every 8 weeks, depending on where we're at, what we're trying to build, stuff like that. If it's a newer athlete because their body really hasn't even gotten accustomed to minimizing protein breakdown and maximizing protein synthesis, it's going to take a little bit longer for me to switch exercises, just because I really want them to get the motor patterns down. I want their body to really become accustomed to it. So then it might be like every 12 weeks. And at that point, I'm not switching it because they need it. I'm switching it because they sort of need it for their mental sanity. People tend to get bored and they don't want to do everything. They don't just want to repeat the same exercise every for 3 months. So an advanced athlete, I might switch things up just to get more muscle development in different areas because they're advanced. They need direct stimulus on pretty much everywhere you can think of. Their body isn't just going to grow indirectly. And then a person who is more novel to the gym, if someone who is new to the gym after 4 weeks, like, all right, well, I'm so bored, like I don't want to squat anymore. If I have to squat again, like I'm going to stop coming. Then I'll switch things up. So it's always important to keep what your client feels in mind. And whenever I send a client a mesocycle, I say, all right, well, this is what I would like to do. I know we did this last time, but if you strongly feel against any of these movements, let me know and we'll switch things up. Because I rather them tell me, hey, I can't freaking stand another front squat. Like, can we please switch things up? Rather than them, one, lie to me or not put everything into the gym because they're just so tired of it. I want people to look at the program and just, they can't wait to go to the gym and do it.
Yeah, I think those are great reasons to switch things up, kind of for that psychological benefits, and then making it specific to what your client actually needs, where they need to build muscle and things like that. I think all those things kind of make a lot of sense. And kind of the last thing that I kind of want to talk about is what are you kind of wanting to study for like your PhD, and what are some areas of interest for you, or what are some topics that you think would really be cool to get a little bit more research on?
So I think I have 3 big things in mind that I would kind of get more research published on. First of all, like I would like to sort of develop the research on muscle damage a little bit more. I was actually that was probably the main thing that I wanted to do up until Schoenfeld and Wackerhage published that paper last month. But I kind of want to do something new, right? So if they publish a paper on it, I don't want to just kind of do the follow-up work to it.
Yeah.
I just got to be like that. But one thing that I've been thinking about lately is training frequency. Now, when we look at training frequency studies, we find that, all right, there might be a small benefit when we're going from like 1 to 2 times per week. But then after that, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot. And even when we go like 1 to 2 times per week, if volume is equated, there doesn't seem to be a very big benefit. Now, that is when volume is equated. It is argued that the big benefit to a higher training frequency, so let's say two times per week to full body every day, the big benefit to that is that because you're getting like 24 hours of recovery, you are going to be able to do more volume and a higher movement quality. At least that is what proponents of high training frequency, such as Menno Henselmans, say. But because we need to do things in the correct science way, we need to equate as many variables as possible. So we equate volume. Now, what I would be interested in looking at is, all right, well, what if we do a training frequency study where we autoregulate volume? So we don't equate volume. We build a very solid program and say we tell people to do like an 8 RIR or something like that and just progress things as we would progress someone's regular training program. Would comparing like a 2 time per week to a 6 time per week training program in that autoregulated situation cause greater amount of volume in the 6 time per week rather than the 2 time per week? And then would that extra amount of volume actually lead to greater hypertrophy? I don't know. And that is something that I would like to research, because so far it's very good science to equate as many variables as possible. That's exactly what we want. But in this situation, it doesn't lead to what people actually do in the gym, because if you do 6 times per week versus 2 times per week, every time you step into the gym, you will likely be a little bit more recovered and be able to do more volume. Now, will that volume lead to greater hypertrophy? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting, because the common theme that I see across most of these frequency studies is that if volume's equated, hypertrophy is similar. Well,
but in the real world, it's not.
Right. Well, what if more frequently people could actually recover a little bit better and produce higher quality volume across the week? Then I see the argument for higher frequencies.
Right. So I think I do think it will lead to higher training volume, but I don't know if that extra training volume is actually going to lead to greater hypertrophy. That's something that's going to be really cool to see.
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting topic. So is that kind of the main topic that you're shooting for then?
I think so. I spoke to you about wanting to do work at FAU, and Dr. Zoda does amazing work on autoregulation. That's where Eric Helms conducted Dr. Eric Helms conducted a lot of his research. So I think that doing that work under him would be absolutely fantastic. And then sort of like the third thing that I have in mind, maybe for later on down the road, is I would kind of like to compare the Dr. Eric Helms compared the effects of percentage-based work to autoregulated work on people just in isocaloric situation, and found the same amount of growth and strength gains from both. I would like to see how that plays out in someone in a hypocaloric diet, because we do know that in a hypocaloric diet, maybe your rating of your RP is a little bit lower, so like you get fatigued quicker. So I would like to see how percentage and RP based work differ in someone in a hypocaloric diet who might not be feeling their best. I mean, you know how it is. Like you're in a hardcore diet, you just like everything kind of gets to you. So some days you feel awful, some days you feel great. So I just kind of like to see how that leads to to muscle gain, or just depending on how severe the diet is, the preservation of lean body mass.
Yeah, I think those would be really, really cool topics as well. And I guess I said that was the last question, but one more. So what kind of drives you to go get your PhD, or what's kind of your why behind that? Because right now I'm getting my master's degree and whatever, and I've considered maybe going to get a PhD. So I'd be really interested in kind of your reasons for why you kind of want to go do this.
Yeah, I see gaps in literature that I want to fill. I think that I love this stuff so much that I want someone, like, I want to provide the literature that other people are going to be using, to be citing, to develop arguments. I want to publish, and really, I suck at moderation, to be completely honest. Like, like, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it full out, and I love this so much. I have a very dear place in my heart to fitness and research and academia. So I want to take this to the highest level. And yeah, when I fall in love with something like this, I just need to take it all the way. And I can't wait for it. And I know it sounds weird, like coming from a bachelor's and already having like my heart dead set on a PhD, but I can guarantee you guys it's going to happen. I'm very excited to do the work that I'm going to be doing.
Yeah, just seeing you light up about it, I can tell that it's something that you're really passionate about, and I'm excited to see your progress towards it over the years here.
Thank you. And that's something that I get a lot, because you've probably seen it in undergrad and masters, that people just kind of study for the test, like, and they're like, oh man, like I just can't wait to have this degree, the CSCS, the certified dietitian, whatever the case may be. People are just like studying for the test and just kind of grinding out. And I almost feel bad for those people that they aren't studying something that just really makes them light up. I mean, when I think about what I'm doing, at the end of the day, here we are, Saturday morning, and I woke up to talk to you about what I study in school. How many other people are this passionate about what they're studying? How many people would wake up and spend all their free time studying even more what they already study in school? Like that's when you know you have something passionate about. And even for you, at the end of the day, you started a podcast for what you do in school. Like that's how much you love this.
Yeah, for sure. What you do in your free time and stuff definitely goes to show what you actually enjoy to do. And I think your point on that is so good, to where a lot of people are just in school to get the degree rather than actually studying something that they enjoy and that they're passionate about.
Right. And I think I have a friend who's in a PhD. Wow, like we almost feel bad for these people that they're not just as passionate and in love with this as we are.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Miguel, I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate this. And like I said, you've had such incredible people on this podcast. I'm very happy to be one of them. And I'm glad that you're on Revive Stronger. Really appreciate all the posts that you make on there. And people should look at your posts on the Facebook group if they haven't already.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And to stem off that before people go here, where can people find you?
So people can find me on Instagram at mblacutt, which is MBLACUTT. People can find my articles on revivestronger.com. And if you want to get coached by me or my wonderful colleagues Steve and Pascal at Revive Stronger, which I'm sure you guys have heard all about on the episodes that they've been on here, you can also go on revivestronger.com.
Right, that sounds good. Well, thank you again, Miguel.
Thank you.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that episode. I know I really enjoyed talking to Miguel there. I know he had a ton of great takeaways there, of a lot of value. And if you took value from this, screenshot this bad boy, put it on your story. If you want to learn more about me or my coaching, check out ryanjsolomon.com, and I will see you in that next episode.